KFC USA by Joshua Baumgarten. Most just stood there, stroking their chins in contemplation, heads slightly tilted to one side or the other. How the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, had actually gotten his head lodged up the actual asshole of the president was, some say, a Chinese enigma. Now, this in itself was not a very perplexing question. It was all quite out in the open and apparent when it came to how these sort of things happen nowadays. The question at the moment that was going around the Hill and in the White House was how they were to get the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan's head, free from the colonic grips of the 45th president. A solution for this modern problem was confounding a plagued nation. The powers that be, well, the powers that actually still cared, convened on the second Thursday of the 7th month to compile a strategic list of viable options of how to extract the proboscis head of the Speaker of the House from the raging anal cavity of the 45th President of the United States of America. The first idea on the list came from David Osborne, Republican, the Speaker of the House of the Kentucky House of Representatives since 2017. Now, Representative Osborne had a brave and bold idea that the only way to save Representative Ryan, whose oxygen levels were depleting by the minute, was to call out the Colonel. All the other powers that be that actually still cared and that had taken part in the emergency meeting were in agreement. It was time to put a call into the Colonel. Representative Osborne, Republican, claimed to have the Colonel on speed dial. Now, some Republicans thought he was just showing off, while others figured that it was possible, considering that both the representative and the colonel were from Kentucky, and that it was actually possible that someone as simple as Osborne might actually know the colonel personally. The colonel may have actually had to call on the representative for a favor from time to time. Anyway, the call was made, and the colonel's people said that the colonel was free that day and would be honored to help out the country in a time of crisis. The colonel said he would be in Washington before the clock struck 12 noon. Lo and behold, 2 minutes before the clock in the Oval Office clanged 12 noon, the colonel and his entourage had arrived at the White House via the South Gate. The colonel, escorted by a few handlers and a crew of minimum-wage slave laborers, along with Republican Representative Osborne in tow, were led to the Oval Office, where the president sat rather awkwardly watching Fox News. The Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan's head was still up the president's poop chute, and the president used the shoulders of the Speaker Ryan as a stool to sit upon. The president was intently watching Fox News with a somewhat constipated look upon his face. The president's aides were unsure if this was due to the president having someone's head physically up his ass or the continuous mention of the president and some sort of pee-pee tape that he may or may have not starred in. Now, anyway, the colonel and his crew of minimum-wage slave laborers were escorted into the Oval Office and introduced to the president. The colonel said in his best regal southern drawl, "Mr. President, Colonel Sanders is here to serve you and our great nation in a time of need. So, if you don't mind, sir, my team of minimum-wage slave laborers and I will proceed with freeing the Honorable Mr. Ryan's head from your derriere." The president turned his attention from the television towards the colonel and said, "Well, Colonel Sanders, it's an honor and a privilege to have such a great American here to help free me from such an uncomfortable burden. Now, please go ahead and do whatever you got to do to get this jabroni's head out of my asshole." Tossing the salad at the president is one thing, but Representative Ryan was a bit too enthusiastic this time. The president then farted, and a muffled grunt was heard from the president's bottom. The body of Paul Ryan shuddered and then fell still. Colonel Sanders set his minimum-wage slave laborers to covering the floor and walls of the Oval Office with sheets of thick plastic. The colonel instructed the president's aides to undress the president and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Paul Ryan. When the Oval Office was covered wall to wall in plastic and the two men, joined by the head and asshole like two Lego blocks, had been stripped naked, the colonel and his crew set to work. 24 family buckets of extra crispy chicken with assorted sauces, 100 sides of mashed potatoes and gravy, and 131 biscuits were loaded into the Oval Office. The colonel started directing his minimum wage slave laborers on how and where to apply the grease from the chicken skin to the bodies of the two grown men. Peeled, extra crispy chicken skin was rubbed along the extremities of the president's genitalia, while the neck of the Speaker of the House was massaged with mashed potatoes and gravy. While using a turkey base that had been sequestered from the White House kitchen, the colonel personally injected chicken grease and mashed potatoes into the rectum of the president in an attempt to lube up the anal cavity from inside. The remaining skinless chicken was fed to the president piece by piece, each piece being dipped in a different sauce beforehand. Once the colonel's minimum wage slave labor crew was finished applying the chicken grease, skin, and mashed potatoes to the bodies of the two Republicans, they were then instructed to line the bodies with 131 biscuits for cushioning. The bodies were then rolled up in the plastic that had covered the floor. Once the two men were encased in the plastic, layered in chicken grease and mashed potatoes, the colonel took out his pipe and lit it. Smiling with some southern satisfaction, the colonel said, Now, all I have to do is just let the body temperature of these two fine, distinguished gentlemen do the rest of the work. I do guarantee that in less than half an hour, the internal combustion of the president's bowels will blow a mighty Confederate blast, releasing the fine Speaker of the House from his anal grips. I do declare that this will solve the problem and free both men from this anal captivity. The president's aides smiled a smile of uncomfortable relief. Then the one presidential aide, the one with the black pouches under her eyes, the one shaped like the grimace from McDonald's, said, Well, I'm terribly sorry, Colonel, but there is no smoking policy in the White House. The colonel smiled and reached into the left inside pocket of his white coat. From the pocket, the colonel removed a coupon for 2 free side dishes with the purchase of a big box meal and handed it to the aide. The colonel winked at the aide and said, I do so apologize for my indiscretions, my dear. The colonel pulled deeply from his pipe and exhaled the smoke into the Oval Office, then said to his crew of minimum wage slave laborers, Our work, I do declare, is done here. We have served our nation well. The colonel turned and walked out of the Oval Office, trailed by his crew of minimum wage slave laborers in tow behind him. 25 minutes later, a large-sounding rumble came from the great plastic human chicken fajita wrapped there on the floor in the middle of the Oval Office. With a mighty burst, the president's intestines pushed forth a gust of flatulence that, in conjunction with all the chicken grease and mashed potatoes that had been massaged into his anus. Slowly, the vice grip from the head of the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and from the president's anus released itself. The Speaker of the House head slid out of the rectum of the president, and Mr. Ryan gasped for air. Upon having his head freed from the poop chute of the leader of the free world, the Speaker of the House began to cry like a small child. Mashed potatoes and gravy and shit smeared across the head and face of the moaning Speaker. The President and the Speaker looked upon one another and both began to laugh. The one man winked to the other. Then the President scooped a handful of mashed potatoes out from behind the ear of the Speaker and hand-fed it to the Speaker. The Speaker licked the President's fingers clean. Well, it is finger-licking good after all, he said. A great national crisis had been averted, and America would sleep better that night.